Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robert de Groot. I'm the Dutch permanent representative, and a very warm welcome here this afternoon at the Dutch Permrep for a bumpy ride. This seminar is called on the Euro 6 vehicle standards, and I think a very relevant time to discuss this issue. Traffic, and especially diesel engines, are one of the main sources of pollution, and for the Netherlands, reducing emission from vehicles is essential, and especially nitrogen oxide emissions. In The Hague, I live next to one of the points which has the highest density of nitrogen oxide emissions in the Netherlands, so I have a personal interest. In the Green Deal, the Commission announced its intention to help local authorities achieve cleaner air and to create a pathway towards zero emissions mobility in the EU. A proposal for more stringent vehicle standards for air pollutants is part of the measures envisaged. But despite a long history of EU vehicle standards, stricter emission limits so far have not necessarily delivered the desired effects. Manufacturers continue to face legal cases, fines, vehicle recalls, and threats to suspend or withdraw type approvals. And at the same time, we also see that more and more cities across Europe are taking local measures to tackle traffic pollution, including vehicle bans. There's clearly still a need to bridge the gap, and how can we ensure that future emissions standards are met? What does that mean for the current negotiations on the EU Euro 6 norms? And quite separately, what are societal consequences of car makers changing their products rapidly? I think we should also keep that in mind. Not this last issue, but the ones I just mentioned before that are the relevant questions we would like to address today, because the negotiations are not just technical, procedural, they are much more political too these days. But these negotiations will determine the effectiveness of future standards for air pollutants. Then we have the Euro 7 standards, which we expect already next year. At that point, we will be able to verify if emission limits are actually met under real driving conditions. And if we want to be able to give a positive response to this question, we need to do no more now. As of today, I don't think we can wait much longer, because I think the whole system, when it comes to our environment, has to be regulated and set in the coming couple of years. In the next 5 years will determine how successful we will be going up to 2030 and 2050. Tomorrow we will see the European Commission coming out with its climate law. I think that also has the intention to really make sure that we get off on the right footing. Today, coming back to the issue this afternoon, we have invited speakers from different stakeholders: science, industry, consumers, NGOs, and the institutions, including the European Parliament. I will now leave you in the trusted hands of Laura Shields, who will be our moderator here this afternoon. I thank you for being here with us, and I want to wish all of you a very constructive event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and good afternoon, everyone. And I am going to be your moderator for the next 2.5 hours. Just to talk you briefly through some of the housekeeping and how this afternoon is going to work first. In a moment, we're going to have a couple of presentations. So the first one is going to be looking at the policy response in the wake of Dieselgate, based on a report that was done by the European Court of Auditors last year. And then after that, we'll be hearing something more technical about the latest data on the technological developments with cars and other vehicles, so that we can see what they are and aren't capable of when it comes to reducing emissions. And then there'll be a discussion panel where we look at the current proposal, but also the future shape of regulation in general when it comes to emissions limits and curbing pollution. And there will be plenty of chances for you to ask questions, provided none of them are too technical. If I don't understand them, you're not allowed to ask it, basically. I'm the lowest common denominator, so nothing goes through me. If you would like to tweet, there is also Wi-Fi. And I've forgotten what the connection for the Wi-Fi is. So we have a slide with the name of it up, and you will be able to see it very shortly. There we go. So Wi-Fi guest and droppies. So if you'd like to tweet the discussion or to post it, then please feel free. You have all the details here. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Ernesto Rossing from the European Court of Auditors, who's going to really do a scene setter to talk us through how the policy response has changed in the wake of Dieselgate and what we can learn. Thank you very much, Ernesto.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to start with a personal story, telling you a bit about my day today. I'm here on behalf of my colleague Indrich Dolezal, who for health reasons couldn't be here today. So as I was driving this morning to my office to what would be a very calm day in Luxembourg, I learned that I was supposed to be here by the afternoon. And so I drove here my car, which I bought some years ago, which was supposed to be a clean diesel car, and now I know it's not. And I have a personal interest in having reliable, truthful emissions figures in the future so that I can finally buy a cleaner car. Well, that being said, and that's a strictly personal story, I'll take you through a bit of the work we did in the Court of Auditors. We published a briefing paper last year in February. Most of the work was done in the second half of 2018. And if you don't know it, you can download it in our website. We analyzed the general response of the EU to the Dieselgate scandal. So this briefing paper, what took us there was the fact that we had done a previous work on air quality, and that was an actual audit work. When I mention audit, it means that we look at an issue and make recommendations to address the issue. This was not the case of Dieselgate, and I'll tell you why in a second. But before that, we had looked into the implementation of the Air Quality Directive. And there we realized that one of the main sources of pollutants that negatively affected the air of big cities around Europe was the emissions from cars. Okay, there were also industrial emissions, but cars were a big part of it. And also, when thinking about the emissions of CO2, road transport also contributes significantly to the emissions of CO2 in the EU. With this in the background, we went back, and given that the EU was already responding to the Dieselgate scandal, we decided to look into what the response was. We could not audit it yet because, unfortunately, as auditors, we always have to look to the past. And it was too recent for us to look at the responses and make recommendations on them. But we at least wanted to set the ground, see what was going on with the direction of travel, and then maybe lay the ground for something more thorough in the future. But that's up for discussion. So based on this background, we looked into the policy response to the Dieselgate scandal. I think everyone is familiar with it now. But we should remind that it all started because it all started across the Atlantic in the US, where regulators started to see that these cars are constantly failing their emissions tests, while in Europe, and in Europe they were passing these tests. And eventually things progressed in a way that it was found that one manufacturer at the time was using devices to cheat the test, and eventually it was found that most manufacturers, if not all of them, were using some either devices or somehow conducting the tests in a way that the cars would not fail. And so the response, this meant that some of the policy responses which were already underway, we should recognize that the EU was already aware to a certain extent of this discrepancy, and it was working to address it, but the Dieselgate scandal made it move more quickly. And that's something we could see when we were doing our work on this. And given this work of the EU, we have now a new system of type approval where there are more powers at the union level now to review the type approval performed at the member states, to even suspend type approval in certain cases, to conduct tests, emission tests of its own, in addition to the tests conducted by the member states. Also, in addition to these extra powers given to the union, the test procedures themselves were changed, whereas before emissions testing relied mostly on one single test. Now there's a combination of two tests, one for real driving emissions and the other one on the lab conditions, let's say, but with stricter parameters than before. And so all of this was part of the response that was being gestated before, but which was accelerated with Dieselgate. To give you an idea, and the panelists who will or may explore this afterwards in greater detail, but before we had the NDC, I don't think I have a pointer here, but before we had an NDC test which consisted of a much more simplified testing for the car emissions, and we are now under the WLTP testing cycle in the laboratory, which has stricter parameters for testing. And you can find all of this information in our briefing paper, so I won't go very deeply into them. And in addition to this WLTP, we have the real driving emissions testing as well, which, of course, whenever you have a testing, you need to find an average. A testing will never truly reflect how cars are used in real life, but the RDE tests, they try to get closer to it in the sense that they combine cycles of driving in the road with driving in the city, with driving in rural areas, in motorways, longer trips, shorter trips, higher speeds, lower speeds. So by doing so, the RDE testing is expected to give us a greater reflection of what emissions will be under real conditions. But of course, actual true emissions will always depend on the driver and on the use of the car you make. If you are a more aggressive driver, it's likely that your emissions will be higher than if aggressive in terms of accelerating too fast and braking too suddenly. It might have higher emissions than if you are a slow driver with a more average speed throughout your journey. So this is just an example of how emissions can change according to driving patterns. But this testing is supposed to bring the emissions figures presented by manufacturers and obtained in the type approval process closer to what they will be in real life. Also, with this, the EU policy response was to tighten the standards for emissions of certain pollutants, like NOx, for example. You have, I need to go back a step before. Like, we had already standards which were getting tighter over time, but the distance between the laboratory figures and what was being observed in road testing was getting bigger. I mean, there was a widening gap between the standard and the actual emissions. And so with this new testing cycle, it makes it more likely that the cars on the road will actually will be following the standards that they're supposed to follow. For the time being, there are different standards for diesel emissions, for diesel cars and for petrol cars for the emission of nitrous oxides and for certain other pollutants, but still the standards tighten over time. When we did our briefing paper, we identified a few challenges. As I said, we did not provide any recommendations, as this was not an audit, but we did identify certain challenges which might need to be monitored over time. So for instance, in the same way, given that tests always have parameters which need to be known beforehand, at least they can have a certain flexibility, but there are parameters, there are boundaries. There might be a case in the future of manufacturers trying again, as they learn how to undergo these testing cycles, to trying to play with them a bit in the same way it was done before with NEDC. Also, a lot of this testing will depend on how effective the market surveillance is, because there will be testing during the type approval of the cars. Type approval, I mean, approving a certain type to get into the market, but also there will be testing conducted through market surveillance by national authorities and by the EU. And if there, so the effectiveness of these checks under market surveillance will be important. It will actually be a major factor in making the implementation of these standards effective. Another thing is that the new legislation opens up the possibility for third parties to conduct their tests, but these tests, they cost a lot. So it means that in practice, only a few third parties might be able to contribute to this market surveillance, given the amount, the cost involved in testing a single car. Also, given that this doesn't change anything related to the cars already in circulation, we might have a delay in terms of the improvement of air quality in our cities. I mean, the legislation, the cars entering the market now, emitting less, might have an effect only 10 years from now in the air quality of our cities. Also, there is a more philosophical discussion throughout the briefing paper, which was on the sense that, and we don't make any recommendation of this, but it's something to keep in mind. The EU relies on type approval and testing heavily during type approval. Whereas, for example, you have another approach in the US where most of the testing is done afterwards. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's something to take into account as the implementation of this new legislation takes place and as these new cars enter into the market. And also there will still be the risk, but that's unavoidable, I guess, of car owners tampering with the vehicles to pass inspections of the cars. But that's something else, actually. The technical inspections are another part which may contribute to keeping emissions low if they are well performed. But at the moment, the technical inspections tend to be more general than the testing performed by the market surveillance authorities. But in any case, in the technical inspections, there will be always the risk, and it's unavoidable that the cars might be tampered with. I'm here presenting to you just, that's a picture from the JRC, where they were testing this new real driving emissions cycle. And this shows you a bit, illustrates a bit what it actually is. Like, you simply take a car under several different conditions out of the lab with a major piece of equipment behind it, and you try to measure its emissions over time. Well, I prefer not to mention anything more because I guess the panelists have plenty to add still, and I'm happy that I have many familiar faces here from the time we worked on the briefing paper. And I'm looking forward to hear from you, and I'm open for questions about our work or anything else related to this issue afterwards. Thank you very much.
We do have time, if it's okay with Ernesto, to take a couple of quick questions now. So if you have any specific questions for Ernesto, feel free to raise your hand. Good, we'll just take a couple. So I'll take these two here. And tell us who you are, of course, as well, please. Sir.
Thomas Friedhoff, consultant on electric mobility from the Netherlands. I think you had a very clear presentation, and I think you rightly touched upon that manufacturers will find a way to avoid new regulations and testing procedures. I'm a free market capitalist, but why don't we take a more American approach and say, like, if you break the rules, you lose your license to sell cars for a year in Europe? I think that's a very good incentive, which is not financial, but a very strong incentive for car manufacturers to actually keep abiding by EU law. What would be your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, I would refrain from making any specific policy recommendations, but that's yes, but that's something that, as I said, we can monitor it over time, the new legislation, how it's implemented, and we need to take into account that there will be the possibility for the national type, there is always the possibility that the national type approval authorities, and now even the EU, the Commission, can suspend the approval of a certain, the type approval of a certain vehicle, meaning when you suspend a type approval, it means that it cannot be sold. So this might be one of the ways that approaches a bit, that makes the approaches more similar in the US and the EU. But I don't want to question the legislation in force before we can actually see its effects. It's something that we need to see how is unveiled over the next few years.
Feel free to ask the panel the same question further down the line. Thank you. And gentlemen here. Oh, if you could just wait for the microphone, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Guido Gielen. I work for the FIA. It's an association for mobility clubs around Europe. My question, I have basically two questions. The first is, how exactly do you perform your auditing work? And what type of information sources do you use? And what is the way how it kicks in with market surveillance, basically? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the Court of Auditors is not part of the market surveillance for cars. Specifically, what we did, usually when we perform an audit, an actual audit, we look into the spending of EU money and if it's being effective, if it's being legal, etc. In this case, but also to look at this, we need to see something that has already some auditable evidence. In this case, everything is too new. When we conducted our study, the legislation was still being implemented, parts of it being drafted, parts of it already implemented, but with transitory provisions. So it meant that we could not actually audit this. We could only have a general overview of what was going on. But when we conduct audits, it depends a lot on what we're auditing, of course. So for this briefing paper, we met with experts from the JRC, for example. We went to various commission services related to market surveillance, related to consumer rights, related to climate protection, and so on. So we consulted different commission DGs. We also sat with some with also experts from the industry, like we met the representatives, we met with a representative from ASEA, for example. We met also with environmental NGOs like Transport and Environment, ICCT. So in this case, we tried to we also sat with national authorities. We were at the TNO in the Netherlands, talking with them and checking a bit how how a member state saw itself within this new framework of enhanced market surveillance. So we looked into how different stakeholders, in this field, were seeing this legislation and were performing their work, or were seeing their work being performed in the future. But also we looked at studies, of course, in scientific literature, and we didn't go deeper than that because, as I said, this was not an audit. If it was an actual audit, we could also have looked at extra sources of information.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernesto. And you'll be sticking around, I think, afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So if you want to carry on the discussion, feel free to do so afterwards. And we'll now move to our more technical presentation. So Rob Culinare is a senior consultant from Sustainable Transport, or TNO, and he's going to talk us through the latest developments in the diesel technology and talk us through what the vehicles now are and aren't capable of when it comes to emissions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to you all. Good to be here. I always love to be in Brussels. Somehow the sun is always shining in Brussels, but it might be my perception. Also, a personal note from my side. It turns out I live just around the corner where the Dutch ambassador also lives. I work and live in The Hague, also close to this, just around the corner of this most highly polluted road in the Netherlands. So I also have an interest in bringing down the emissions of vehicles. In the meantime, I was hoping the... Oh, I have to... okay.
Just click on that one.
This plus, okay.
One more? Yeah.
Okay. I'm asked by the Dutch delegation to present here what we think are the facts of real driving emissions, the latest insight. Feel free to check the facts if you think they are not correct, but at least an attempt to bring you the latest facts on real driving emissions. And when it comes to emissions, what really counts is what occurs on the road, not on paper. Only thing that's, important is what is achieved on the road. And if I look at the on-road, the real-world emissions of diesel vehicles, particularly the most persistent emission we have at the moment, the NOx emissions, for long we have been relying on laboratory-based test procedures. Well, if you look at this picture, for long we didn't succeed in really bringing down the emissions. Limit values were going down in the legislation from Euro 0 to Euro 1 to Euro 2 and so on, but the on-road emissions didn't go down to the extent of the limit values. Only when on-road testing was introduced, both for light duty and for heavy duty. For light duty, it was the introduction of RDE. For heavy duty, it was the introduction of PEM's heavy duty legislation. Then emissions went down dramatically. So, in our view, this strongly advocates that we should not rely solely on laboratory tests, but it's very important also to have this on-road testing included. I guess the handout will be made available to the audience. Okay. I have here not the latest version of my presentation.
Where is she? Okay. She's right over here. I'll go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, I will skip this one and I will come back to it later on. So, RDE is the new standard. RDE determines the emissions and the stringency of emission legislation for light duty in Europe. Not the laboratory tests, but the RDE determines the stringency of the legislation. That's okay.
Do you have, yeah?
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
I will manage somehow.
Okay.
Okay. So, RDE determines the stringency of the EU emission legislation. And you could advocate also from already back to the 2007 Euro 6, Euro 5, Euro 6 legislation that the RDE performance, the real world performance, was already the basis for what should be achieved on roads. You might also advocate that looking at this recital, and I think that's one thing that also has been covered by the court ruling of the European Court, that, well, that there is from this recital not really a mandate to introduce conformity factors within the RDE legislation. But if there is not really a legal basis for a conformity factor, is there a technical argument for introduction of conformity factors? Well, if we look at real-world emission measurements, real-world emission performance of vehicles, modern Euro 6D temp vehicles, well, we see that there is no real reason for high conformity factors. Already back in 2017, we've measured a couple of, 2018, we measured a couple of vehicles. There was one vehicle having some problems meeting the conformity factor 2.1. There was a vehicle that almost came close to a conformity factor of 1.0, almost under all driving conditions, not just RDE valid trips, but all other trips we performed in the Netherlands. And there was a car that was even well below a conformity factor of 1. Not just under RDE valid trips, but also, once again, under all driving conditions we managed to achieve in the Netherlands. So, my statement, technology is readily available already under the Euro 6D temp stage to meet the conformity factor of 1. Oh, that's okay. Then I come to the conformity factor approach under in the current legislation. It's quite clear from previous reports of JRC that the conformity factor is based on a worst case approach. JRC was looking at the worst case of uncertainties from PEMS systems. When RDE was introduced, this final conformity factor was set at 1.5. Already based on a review in 2017 from JRC, this conformity factor is lowered from 1.5 to 1.43. Or the margin is 0.43. It's always slightly confusing what the number is about. And according to a latest report of JRC, just published 1 week ago, or at least less than 2 weeks ago, the new review shows that the conformity, or the margin, the uncertainty margin for currently is close to 0.32. But then again, this is the worst case approach. So there is, reasons to start the process to modify, to amend the current conformity factor, change it from 0.43 to 0.32, or even take a step further, that is, introduce a mechanism that would stimulate or force innovation in the PEMS equipment. It's mainly the uncertainty in the PEMS equipment, the equipment measuring the on-road emissions. This equipment just shown by Ernesto in this picture that's behind installed at the back of the car. In the current system, there is no real incentive to force innovation. So our appeal is, you could change the system to bring in an incentive to go for, to have innovation in the PEM systems. Then I go back to one of the previous slides, this one. A special topic about the conformity factor for light commercial vehicles, LCVs. The LCVs from class 2 and class 3 don't have to comply with the conformity factor of 1.43. They still have the possibility to comply with a conformity factor of 2.1. Is there a reason why they should have a higher conformity factor? Of course, there can be all kinds of reasons, political reasons whatsoever. But looking at if there is a technical reason for this higher conformity factor, well, we looked at in one of our programs to the real-world emissions of a lot of light commercial vehicles. And what we found was from Euro 5 to Euro 6, there has been a dramatic improvement in on-road emissions, at least in a couple of models from a couple of manufacturers in on-road emissions. On the left, of course, you understand that red is high emissions. This is the engine performance, the emission performance of a light commercial vehicle from Euro 5 to Euro 6. Getting rid of red, that means getting rid of high emissions in on-road performance is good. This is also from a report that has been mentioned in the left bottom, where we did some measurements on 16 light commercial vehicles. And also there we found that we measured low on-road emissions already back in 2017. We see no justification for this reason to continue with this conformity factor of 2.1. Technology is readily available. And one thing to remember is light commercial vehicles already have a higher limit value, not the 80 milligrams for passenger cars and the commercial vehicles in class 1, but higher emission values, 125 milligrams per kilometer. And if you apply a conformity factor to those higher emissions, well, you get even multiplication. So you get even a higher allowance on top of the limit value for those types of vehicles. This is on the conformity factor. In our view, from the measurements, the real-world measurements we've performed, we see no reasons for high conformity factors, or reasons for continuation of the conformity factor, the 2.1 conformity factor for light commercial vehicles in class 2 and 3. This was what I would call the short-term discussions. When we look at the midterm discussions, it's about the next step in Euro standards, whether you want to call them post-Euro 6 or Euro 7. It changes day by day. There are, in our view, some important aspects in this discussion, the Euro 7 discussion. One was already mentioned by Ernesto, the importance of having market surveillance and in-service conformity checks. Also from our side, the appeal to member states to quickly and generously start their activities on market surveillance. I think this is really what will make the difference. Not just rely on type approval and type approval stages only, but also having those checks via market surveillance and in-service conformity. Another point is RDE, but also PEMS for heavy duty brought dramatic reductions of NOx emissions, mainly by a better performance of SCR systems applied to those cars. But by improving the operation of these SCRs, we've seen that also ammonia emissions are going up. Especially for the Netherlands, we know this is a hot topic at the moment. Another aspect already touched upon also by Ernesto is the lifetime performance of a vehicle. With RDE and in-service conformity checks and so on, the first 100,000 kilometers seems to be covered rather good. But what happens after the vehicle has reached this mileage of 100,000 kilometers? In a contract with the Ministry of Environment in the Netherlands, we performed some tests on petrol vehicles with a slightly higher mileage close to 200,000 kilometers. And what we found was in 1 out of 6 vehicles, emission control didn't work any longer. And those cars passed the periodical technical inspections. Nevertheless, emissions were 10 times higher than we usually find. So there is still, in the current legislation, something missing to ensure that during the whole lifetime of the vehicles, emissions will be sufficiently low. And it was not just one brand or one vehicle, it was across the whole fleet that we found those faults in the after-treatment system of petrol cars. Another issue for those who are closely or are following the discussions on Euro 6, the graph to the left might look familiar. This is one of the graphs I've presented in one of the stakeholders meetings organized by DG GROW, one of the ECFAS meetings. Then I had the head-on of consultant for DG GROW. But what is clearly showing is that the current legislation is very complex, and with its complexity, it already also brings a high test burden, room for interpretations, and it might lead to the introduction of all kinds of test flexibilities. Euro 7 might bring a window of opportunity to take out some of the complexities of the European emission legislation. We think that stronger reliance on this on-road testing, I refer back to my first slide, on-road testing really made the difference. I think stronger reliance on on-road testing could seriously reduce complexity. I think those are a couple of points I'd like to share with you. First of all, I've been dealing with the short-term issues on conformity factor. Second part was more about the mid-term discussions on Euro 7. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rob. And if you have any questions, now's your time to put them to Rob. So here's your chance, or he will be around at the end as well.
Yes.
But if you'd like to ask a question now, are you going to ask the same one? Okay, go for it.
I find these results actually quite shocking. When you mentioned that after 100,000 miles that the emissions go up this much, if there is something wrong with electric vehicles, it's on the front page of AD, De La Femme, etc. When will you present this to the AD, De La Femme? And as in, what I mean is, I think most heavy vehicle owners are not aware of this, so they don't know they need to do this maintenance, and there's a lot of misinformation about electric cars. I find this, as I said, these results quite shocking, but this is to an audience of people who follow this. So how do we make sure that vehicle owners and general press knows this as well?
Yes, this report is public. It has been sent to the House of Chambers in the Netherlands, and well, so the politicians should be and can be aware of this, and it has been already mentioned in a couple of journals in the Netherlands. So it's public.
Yes, you can bring this up on the panel if you want. Yeah. Yes, lady here.
Hi, my name is Anna Maria Spirioni. I'm from the Mayor of London office. Have you conducted any research on the impact of tire and brake wear of these?
No.
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 Okay.
No.
And then my other question is, you said that a more simple test procedure would be favorable, but would that mean then that all vehicles should be performing below the limit values to all conditions, which means we have to stop with boundary conditions? And how easy would that be to be acceptable and introduced in legislation?
Actually, a very difficult question, because I'm also a consultant to DG Grow. I think this is one of the points that perfectly fits in discussions on post Euro 6 in stakeholders meetings that will be organized by DG Grow. Next one will be 4th of May, 5th of May, early May.
Okay. Any further questions for Rob before we move to the panel? No? Okay, thank you very much, Rob.
You're welcome.
And we'll be talking to you again at the end. So I'd like to introduce our panel now. If the guests come up and take their seats, and I will introduce you all. You should have a name tag there. Thank you. Thank you. So in this panel, we're going to sort of evaluate what tougher emissions limits values have actually meant for making cars cleaner and safer for public health. We're also going to be looking at the current proposals that are due to be voted on in the Parliament in the next few weeks, and also look forward to the kind of regulatory architecture that the different stakeholders would like to see going forward in relation to clean vehicles and air pollution curbing in general. So to introduce the guests, I'm going to start from the right-hand side. Jens Müller is the Manager of Air Quality at Transport and the Environment. Joanna Szaszowska is the Head of Unit for DG Grow at the European Commission. In the middle, we have Monique Goyens, who is the Director General of BEUC, the European Consumers Organization. To her left is Paul Greening, who is from the European European Automotive Manufacturers Association, where he's a Senior Director of Emissions and Fuels. And then right on my right here, we have Bas Eickhout, who is, of course, a Green and EFA MEP in the European Parliament. So thank you all very much. Jens, I'm going to start with you, just to get the broad general opening, if I may. How has the move to tougher emissions limit values for on-road transport, so cars and vehicles, has it actually made them cleaner? And if so, how much? And what's been the main factor, based on also what we've heard already this afternoon?
It's a very good question, and good afternoon, everyone. Many people do ask us the same, like, what's really changing? And I think we heard this morning already that there's still some issues out there. So we heard about the most polluted place in the Netherlands. Also, probably those who came here by walking, they noticed that these places around here are also very polluted. So if we look at the data, the official data, we do finally see some improvements in air quality and also in the pollution that comes from cars. But actually, we're not really calling this a success, given that it's been 12 years since we introduced the Euro 5 and Euro 6 limits. So 12 years to just respect now the laws on the road and not just in a laboratory isn't really a big achievement in our opinion. So we do recognize the efforts that have been made, and I think also, especially at the European level, more than at the national level in many member states. I think for most governments it's true that they haven't really wanted to go after the sources of emissions. And so we do give credit to the introduction of on-road testing, which has been said already this afternoon, has been a big step forward, but it only goes so far in really achieving what now is on the agenda, which is not only respecting the limits within the test conditions, but really on the road, under all conditions, and going towards zero pollution. So yes, improvements, but let's not forget, first of all, the legacy of Dieselgate still on the road. More than 50 million dirty diesels, according to our own calculations from September. So we still have a big issue, and it's not enough that now in Germany, Volkswagen says we will give some money to German consumers, and well, for the rest of Europe, no solution. And we also think that definitely we shouldn't stop here. So now we've seen that the data shows we've seen some improvements. It's possible to do it, so let's now also move the step forward and not just look at the current laws that we have today.
Mm-hmm. Monique, coming to you, from the sort of public or consumer perspective, how much evidence is there about whether or not people really want clean cars, and how do they experience this transition? I mean, where's the thinking and also the knowledge levels around it in the wake of Dieselgate in particular?
Well, you saw the knowledge level.
Yeah, exactly.
Of, I think a very educated consumer there. I think that people just...
oh, is it not on? You might need to switch it on.
I need to switch it on. I thought it was automatic and not on knowledge gap. Yeah, maybe no, I think it's on. Yes. Well, you know, consumers expect to have a car that is in conformity, another use of conformity, with what they have been sold. So they have received, in fact, they are using cars that they expect to be cleaner than they are in reality. And in fact, for the moment, consumers are still in the middle of the Dieselgate scandal. Most of consumers in Europe have not yet been compensated. Yes, there has been a little bit of light last week because of the settlement, but this is only a very, very tiny part, and it has been done in very, very complex circumstances. Can I say Volkswagen have been dragging their feet, and they are still dragging their feet to compensate consumers that have been ripped off, to put it bluntly. So don't expect people to have a lot of a high level of trust and of expectations that the car industry is going to be part of the solution. So that's certainly something that is clear. Many people, I mean, those who are owners of Volkswagen or other cars that have been cheating, have not yet been compensated. There are diesel bans in some cities, meaning that the consumers who own diesel cars in those cities cannot use their cars anymore. Have a loss of value of those cars. Overall, by the way, diesel cars are losing value. So for the consumers who own those cars, it's really a problem. And then also, even if you are not a car owner, you are breathing the air that is not as clean as it should be. So many people experience quite a negative experience around the current system. Not everything is negative, though, because one of the good things that maybe many of you don't know is that because of the behavior of Volkswagen, we have been able to obtain collective redress discussions at European level. Isn't it true? Yeah. So, I mean, this was the positive effect because Volkswagen has been so misbehaving, can I say so? And with all respect to your association. That the commissioners in charge and the commission in charge of considering since decades whether they should adopt a collective redress proposal at European level, they have decided at the end to do so, because only collective redress would allow consumers to stand up against Volkswagen, and that's what they did in Germany. That's what they're still trying to do in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Belgium, and in the other countries the collective redress is not yet available. There is other good news, like you have been saying, there have been improvements, but that have not yet trickled down to the consumer on the market. And can I say, one of the good news is that at the end, now electric cars are becoming a reality for consumers more and more. It has also taken a lot of time, but since the beginning of this year, we see more offers on the market for electric cars. And there is still more to do, of course, in terms of infrastructure and in terms of consumer information. But I think the alternative for the conventional cars is there, and that might be taken up much quicker than expected.
Thank you. Joanna, the Commission, or rather the standards for the Euro 6 limits were brought in 2007, and the real driving emission test didn't come in until 2015, 2016. You know, there's been general support for it here that it has made a difference, but why was it such a lag between the two? Why did it take that long to get the real driving emission testing scheme set up?
Well, thank you for the question, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a bit difficult to talk about what happened almost 10 years ago, but nevertheless I will make an effort and try to give you an answer and put it in the perspective, because I think what is important about this question is not really what has happened in 2011, but what is happening now, if you allow me to answer it this way. So first, why did it take so long? You would say, why 5 years in order to come up with experiment, testing and regulatory process? Indeed, it's very long, but you have to remember that at the time, RDE and what we have started developing in the European Union, so JRC, was by far the standard bearer, and there was no other country or region in the world that we could rely on while developing this procedure. We were looking, for example, at the ways of testing. Before coming up with PEMS procedures, there were other options. It took years and took months to discard and to evaluate what is really good or what is not good. So 3 years of experiments, it seems not being excessive. Then you may say, why did it take a year and a half? That would be super fast. A year and a half to adopt the legislation. It is long indeed, but to put things in perspective, we are discussing today adoption of RDE regulation in UNIC. So we want to extend it to become a global standard. And guess what? We have RDE today in place for several years. Everyone knows, all the contracting parties know how the rules look like, how they're implemented, but yet it takes already more than a year to discuss about it. So when you compare a process which is multilateral and we already have 1 year to adopt it and a year and a half at a time, I don't think there is such a big discrepancy. But then coming back to something which is more fundamental, I think you are right to ask this question, provided that the answer shows that there were lessons learned from the processes. And if you ask me, was it optimal? Well, I cannot judge. I was not there, my colleagues were not there. But instinctively, yes, I would say probably things could have been done a little bit faster, which doesn't mean that what had happened at the time was wrong. It was a certain cas de figure, and we functioned along the lines and along the circumstances that were there. But what is far more important is what has happened since and what we learned since. And if you look at the achievements between October 2015 and November last year, where we effectively adopted the latest step in terms of heavy-duty legislation, this is enormous progress in terms of experiments, engagement from JRC, engagement from member states, and regulatory initiative from the Commission. So please keep in mind that there was a long learning process, and I think we arrived at a pretty satisfactory moment today.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to come straight to you in terms of what the industry has learned from the introduction of this kind of testing. Do you think in general it has been successful, the real driving emission testing, and also how has it transformed the car industry, both in terms of technology, but also the approach towards tackling air pollution more specifically?
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, we certainly think that the RDE legislation is successful. Joanna's made very valid comments. It did take a long time because basically there was no other global region that had a menu of such a test. The United States have a multiple cycle approach, but with limits appropriate to the driving on those cycles. But that was evaluated by the EU, but it was not taken forward as being a suitable solution for the EU. And the EU started from scratch, essentially developing an RDE. And in doing so, although our industry was faced with four very complex regulations in a very short space of time, the work that was done to deliver those regulations was quite admirable in many respects. The end result of that legislation, though, now is that vehicles are extremely clean in the emissions that matter, in the area that matters, and that's where they're used on the road, particularly in city hotspots. And it's very clear, and Rob showed some results, but there are far more other results which definitely show that NOx is being tackled through the RDE legislation from vehicles, be they cars, LCVs, and also heavy-duty vehicles, but they're not subject to that particular type of regulation. They have their own on-road emission measurement requirements. And vehicles, although they are meeting or achieving very low levels, the next step in the main is moving to now what we call Euro 6D. Many cars are already approved to Euro 6D. LCVs will soon be approved to Euro 6D. There's been a question about the 2.1 validity. We think it's valid, and we think that the framework that was given to industry, in many respects in quite short time to react with some serious changes and some serious engineering, presented a playing field which industry has now addressed, and we don't advise any changes to that playing field at the moment because we think it is delivering the results that were intended.
Thank you. Baz, thank you. So you can pick up on any of that as you wish.
No, we have only limited time, I guess, right?
Yeah, I was actually also going to say, based on what we've been hearing, but also since the lessons learned since Dieselgate, if we have learned them, there was a parliamentary investigation that got set up into that too. Based on what's come out since then, do you think we're now on the right track when it comes to tackling diesel emissions?
We're on a better track, but not the right track, no. And I have to say that if you hear some of these comments, you wonder how much we learned indeed. First of all, Joanna is of course very polite to the car industry as well, which I wonder why. Because one of the reasons why it got so delayed action was because of the car industry. The idea was quite quickly already that PEMs were the solution, but then the car industry gave all kind of alternatives which had to be investigated and took years before then in the end we came back, oh, maybe it should be PEMs. So that took years. So that was really a deliberate delay by the car industry on getting to real driving emission testing. So I would say as a commission now, I would be less polite to the car industry, having seen all this, the delaying tactics, the cheating. Then at a certain moment it also stops, right? So I think one of the lessons that should be learning is that tough regulation and making sure that it's all be lived up to is really bringing innovation and is really bringing cleaner cars. That's the biggest lesson, and I'm still not 100% sure that the Commission has learned that lesson. And for me, that is the key lesson. We have been way too weak, way too nice to the car industry, who gave in return cheating devices, and meanwhile we were polluting our streets and our air. That was basically going on. And I think that's really what we see now, because every time, on every move we made, the car industry always said, it's not possible. We can't deliver. That's the basic argument of any of the car industry for years now. So in 2007, 80 was impossible to reach, even with the laboratory testing. So, I mean, that argument has been repeated time and time and again. And what you see is the improvement is getting there when we make sure that they have to deliver. And I think that should be the key lesson. We have to be tough to the car industry. You can't trust them. Yes, you can't trust them, and make sure that they deliver, because that's the only way to clean them up. And that's not my preferred solution, but after all these years, unfortunately, that's the basic lesson we learned. Sorry.
Paul, do you want to respond to any of this?
Well, how manufacturers deal with the legislation, it's their business. It's not the business of an association for competitiveness reasons. But I think the work on RDE started early. You know, the legislation itself took time. The development work started early, and once we knew that RDE was coming, 2010, 2011, certainly the work did start. It does not happen overnight. We're not making widgets. We're making very complex products. So due diligence had to be done, and those design efforts had to be flexible and change as the regulations came along, because we didn't have the package of measures all presented to do the job in one effort. So you know, there is some cause for concern there about how long it took, But in reality, what has been delivered, I think, is now the end of the story, and then we look forward. In many respects, the industry is looking forward, and you've seen our Green Deal 10-point plan, embracing the ambitions of the new European Commission towards climate neutrality by 2050. The engagement of the industry is serious, and the engagement of the industry is real to make progress.
Thank you. We're going to talk about the Green Deal now, actually. Could we get the slide up about, because we're going to go to round 2 and look at the perspectives on the proposal that's in hand. So this is the Commission's proposal on amending legislation that's going to be voted on in the EP in the next few weeks. Basically, what you've got up there is the judgment from the European Court of Justice, which was from the court case that was brought by 3 European cities, so Paris, Brussels and Madrid, where they were clearly feeling concerned that how should we put it, they weren't able to make a decision about what they could do at a local level to protect citizens from air pollution because they didn't understand the limits and particularly the conformity factors in question. Now, Joanna, this seems to be an identical proposal that's been brought back by the Commission. Given that you've got this criticism, particularly also from the Court of Justice, who've said it's impossible to determine during a test, an RDE test, whether or not a vehicle being tested complies with the limits or is even close to them, and then the degree of error involved in the conformity factors does not enable with a reasonable degree of reliability the compliance with the NOx limits, why are you bringing back the same proposal?
Sure, but before I have to reply to Bas, because I suppose what provoked him was that Paul said that he agreed with me. Paul never agreed with me, not publicly, yeah? And I am polite, Bas, to everyone, indiscriminately, including to you. But it doesn't prevent me from speaking my mind, if there is a case. So, on the regulation, you are right. We brought exactly the same text, and there is a reason for that. The court questioned the way the Commission set out the conformity factors, and the court said that we went beyond the mandate. And what we did, we followed the court's assessment in this respect. And since the regulation, RDE regulation stays, it's only a fragment of it that has been questioned, we brought back exactly the questioned element of the regulation in a way that court would expect us to do, would have expected us to do from the very beginning, meaning by a co-decision. The reason why we did it, and the reason why we didn't change it, was because we are of the view that at this stage of the work, this is about legal certainty that has to be preserved, given the deadlines and the values that has been set out in 2016 regulation, which doesn't at all prevent us from moving ahead with anything that might be needed in this area, and the place to do this is Euro 7 project. So the purpose of tabling the proposal that is being now at this stage of reaching trilogues was to bring back what the court said was not valid or was done wrongly in order to make sure that authorities or manufacturers that had been working based on the deadlines set out in this regulation can continue unless decided differently by the court. So that was the reason, and that's why we didn't change any parameters or we didn't go beyond what was strictly necessary.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to come to the broader politics of this point in a moment, Baz. I can see you're already grinning away at the end.
I'll take a zip.
So what we've heard this afternoon is that, certainly from Rob's presentation in particular, that the technology means now that the high level of conformity factors, is the big margin of error, aren't needed anymore because the technology is there. So from a manufacturing perspective, why still keep these conformity factors in? If the technology is there, what is the reason to still have it? And even in this current round, given what seems to be suggested, and even the criticism from the Court of Justice, why not get it right in this round?
We don't think there's need to do that. The current framework of RDE in 2 steps was presented to the industry as what it should do over the next years. And that's the basis on which it made very serious investment, design and development decisions for introducing new vehicles. The 2.1 is already history, one might say, for the new approval of cars and the lighter vans. It's still important for the heavier vans to allow new approvals, and we've done some internal checking, and product planning still demands that the manufacturers would have that flexibility as the transition towards all vehicles complying with the 6D framework, which means a conformity factor of 1, so that the vehicle must meet at the tailpipe the emission limits. That was what RDE was designed to do, and that's what manufacturers are doing. They have to have emissions lower than the limit at tailpipe. The extra bit, the error margin, is what is there to deal with when the gases leave the tailpipe and go into this PEMS box for measuring. We don't make those, other people make those, but those boxes are variable. Unfortunately, they're not as accurate as a lab CVS system. They have a large amount of variability, unfortunately. They're on the back of a car, as the picture showed. Not a valid RDE test, incidentally, off-road, but it bounces around. It's subject to altitude, temperature, and other conditions. And the error of the measurement is real. So that is why the legislation presented 1 plus error margin, to show that the 1 is the obligation of manufacturers, which we are achieving, and the error margin is the variability of the measuring procedure, which must be retained as far as we're concerned. The JRC made a report just recently which was suggesting that it could be 3.2 from 4.3 for NOx. There's no discussion about the particle number. We have looked at the JRC report and we have some issues with it. We don't think it justifies reduction down to 0.32 at this particular time, primarily because the PEMS machines themselves haven't improved. There's been no physical improvement in these boxes, so why should the variability get any better? So in that regard, what the Commission presented, and as what we have said, should enable the industry to have legal certainty on what it was given to do. The court ruled that the Commission used comitology wrongly. The Commission has now presented that for decision by the co-legislators. In our opinion, that should be a like-for-like transposition of the same requirements.
Okay. Jens, I'm going to bring you in at this point. You can obviously pick up on what Paul has said, and also Joanna. But last year, T&E, so your NGO, Transport and the Environment, for those of you who don't know it, analysed data that the manufacturers themselves had produced, which also said that most cars last year already complied with the NOx limits. So in that sense, what is the relevance of this proposal? I mean, why are we wasting, well, not wasting, but why are we spending so much energy on it if it's, you know, the vast majority of cars are already compliant? Why are we so concerned about it in particular?
So I said initially that now we're 12 years after the adoption of Euro 6 limits, and we're also 4 years later, basically, than last time that we discussed the issue of the conformity factors initially. So why should we just keep the same and not learn from what we did in the past? And we actually were puzzled by the mixed messages from the car industry, basically, because if you look at advertisements today, also what you said, Paul, on the one hand, you're saying our cars are extremely clean now, there is no problem. On the other hand, you're also saying, but we still should keep the conformity factors from the past and keep all these uncertainties in the end, speaking of legal certainty, all the uncertainties of whether the car complies or not. And so looking at the data that was presented by TNO, looking also at our own analysis of the manufacturers' data that we did last year, and even from motorist organizations, they all say, well, basically, most of the cars, under the test conditions at least, stay well under the limits on average. So why should we keep these uncertainties where consumers and also organizations, people out there don't know, is the car actually complying with the limits? Well, we don't know. Because actually, as the court said, there's no way to be certain about this with the current level that is introduced. So we think we need a law that sets the right incentives. It should do two things. On the one hand, it should make the PEMS more accurate, definitely, and I think the work that the Commission has been doing with the JRC is very valuable because it shows there are improvements. They didn't reinvent the wheel, the PEMS wheel, but they definitely make improvements there. And also secondly, of course, we should set standards that do not reward the companies that are lagging behind and somehow meeting the limits, maybe with all the uncertainties, but they should safely meet the limits, stay under limits, so that under any condition, they can guarantee their consumers no problem to meet the limits, even if there is some measurement uncertainty. That's what a law, in our opinion, in 2020 should do, and it's really important we get there. And I think I'd be interested in seeing how we can bring these two mixed messages from the car industry together into one clear message now to say, we guarantee you that your car will be truly clean on the road under all conditions.
Yeah. Baz, what role do you see for the Parliament to have at this sort of rather critical time, particularly also, Parliament didn't actually object to the introduction of conformity factors when they were brought in. So how do you see in this window that we have over the next month or so, what role do you see Parliament playing?
Well, now, first of all, on that the Parliament didn't object, we did an attempt to object, right? So it's not that the Parliament just let this one go. There was just no majority to support it because the way the Commission did it through delegated act required an absolute majority of the Parliament to object to it. So you are weakening the instruments of the Parliament, but it's for no one a surprise that there was a huge opposition towards what the Commission was doing. I therefore also object to kind of the car industry saying like, this was promised to us and we are working on that, and now suddenly there are maybe people that want to change the rules. No, the rules in place are from 2007. And there already, as being said, under normal conditions, it was very clear what the targets for the industry are. If the industry in 2007 would have been so dedicated to deliver on the law that was adopted, we would not have had this discussion now. And now suddenly, when there was a delegated act by the Commission, where there was a lot of opposition to, and now they say, well, we are now suddenly implementing it, maybe we learned something, but then unfortunately we get to the car industry immediately saying, spreading doubt on a JRC report, who is coming to an uncertainty margin of 1.32 on the basis of a worst case scenario. So this, let this also sink in. Their 1.32 is their worst case scenario. It's a heavy van driving in a city on circumstances. So it's the worst case. Then they get to the highest uncertainty of the PAMs, and that's the level that they take. When I asked them why this level, to be on the safe side was the answer. When I asked the safe side for whom, for citizens or for car industry, he had to acknowledge for car industry. If now on top of that, the car industry is saying, well, maybe this 1.32, we have our questions on it, my conclusion is the car industry did not learn its lesson. Because they are again going for the full uncertainty, the highest ranges, and the right to pollute. And I was expecting from the car industry taking their lessons, learning their lessons, and now indeed complying with the laws because they know that they should go to a conformity factor of 1, because what can you expect from the Parliament? The Parliament did an entire inquiry committee on it and came to the conclusions, no matter what we do with conformity factor, in the end, the conformity factor should disappear. It should become 1. And that you can expect from the Parliament to put that back in place as well. And that is very consistent with what we adopted in 2007. So we are being consistent here. So please, car industry, don't start complaining about that you have tried to wiggle your way out of everything and now being surprised that maybe in the end you just have to comply with the law that we adopted in 2007.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Monique in first, and then Paul, I will come to you before we go to a round of questions, I promise. Monique, just, you know, all this discussion around conformity factors and 1.32 and this, that, and the other. Is this going to help consumers to the extent that they even know that this legislation is going through Parliament at the moment and then is going to go to trilogue and all the rest of it, to the extent that there's even any sort of understanding of what is going on? Is this going to help, or is it just going to look like a fudge?
Well, if they know what is going on in the present state of the proposal, they would be very upset. There is a fundamental principle in consumer law, which is the product that you receive should be in conformity with the product that you have ordered. You order 1 kilo of pasta. If you have 750 grams of pasta, you are not happy. You order a washing machine that has been sold to you. You buy a washing machine that is being sold for consuming 1 kilowatt hour for a cycle of washing. If it consumes 1.5 kilowatt hour, you can bring it back. It is not in conformity. You have a guarantee against that. So in fact, the factor of conformity, which is in fact a factor of non-conformity, in fact, if you really put it bluntly, is institutional greenwashing. This is something that should not be allowed because it in fact misleads consumer that a car that they expect to be in line with a certain level of emission standards can not be in line with these emission standards. So it is uncertain. It doesn't bring consumer confidence like it should bring. So we also believe that it is very important also in the context of the Green Deal, but maybe we come back to that later, but it's important to be ambitious if you really want to have clean cars and to get rid of the conformity factor, because this is something that is not in line with reasonable consumer expectations.
Thank you. Paul? And then I'm going to take a round of questions from the audience.
Just very brief. I mean, if you look at a car that makes 79 milligrams of NOx, a diesel car, where the limit's 80, and then you apply the 0.43, you'll be below the threshold, the 1.43, which is the conformity factor. If the car makes 82 and you apply the 0.43 against the limit, you'll be above the 1.43 threshold. So there is no doubt that the target for vehicle manufacturers has to be meeting the limit and being below the limit to take into account the fact that anybody could test a car on RDE using an old PEMS machine, which may or may not have a 43, it may have a 0.5 of physical error margin, under any of the combination of worst-case boundary conditions, which is what the obligation of car makers is, to achieve the limit under any worst-case boundary conditions, because the error margin, the variability of the machine is real. Even if you got rid of the conformity factor and you tested cars, you're still using the same machines, which would have the same level of variability. You just can't get away from it, unfortunately. We'd all love it if there was zero variability of PEMS, or PEMS was as good as the lab-based measurements. They're not. And that is just a physical reality.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to take a round of questions from the audience now. So if you could wait for the microphone, tell us who you are and to whom your question is addressed, that would be great. And when I say questions, I do mean questions, not statements, please. Thank you. So, gentleman here.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. My name is Torsten Weg and I work for the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Environment. A question especially to Paul, to ASEA, which was more or less already on the table. An often heard argument from the automotive industry is that we need to sell diesels in order to meet the CO2 standards, the 95 gram and what is upcoming in the next years. So you must have a really interest in an image of a real clean diesel. So is it then the time to say now, to give that statement, also if there might be some boxes not performing as well, but as long as we see that it's technically possible that cars perform well below these 80 grams within these PEMS conditions, so it's doable. And we don't need any more these conformity factors. We can deliver, we can produce them, and we do it because we want to sell this and we want to get back the trust of the consumers and the reliability. So that would be, I think, now the moment to do this. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before, are there any other questions at this point? Are you being paid by the panel?
No.
Okay.
I have a solution for Paul and perhaps a new business model. So yes.
Okay. All right, you can ask a question if you like.
Mr. Greening, you've rightfully faced a lot of criticism. I think I want to present you with an opportunity. Electric third-party charging stations are pretty well in Netherlands, Germany, wind sport areas, Italy a bit. France is terrible. Literally 2/3 of the charging stations was put down by the French company that operates that last week or something. Car dealers, independent dealers, are starting to realize more. If they want to sell cars in the future, they need charging infrastructure. You can leave that to the oil companies, or you can make sure there's proper fast charge third-party infrastructure. Because that will be your incentive to sell cars in the future. Without it, you won't, and otherwise, it's, as I said, it's also a business opportunity, so I would invite you to take it.
Thank you. So if you could take the first question about the green...
I'll deal with the second one, Torsten, apologies. Very quickly. Well, ACEA at the moment is participating in the review of the Directive on Alternative Fuels Infrastructure, where we will be requesting quite a lot of progress in terms of the required numbers of recharging stations for electric vehicles, but also alternative fuel delivery stations as well. So it's part of a bigger perspective, but it's clear that the industry, as it's moving forward, will see a developing role for electrically chargeable vehicles. It has to be the case. 95 grams is tomorrow, but coming on the horizon will be 2025, coupled with the reviews of targets for 2030 and beyond. And that will force the automakers' hands in certain technical directions. That's without happening. Coming back to Torsten's question, well, CF equals 1 could disappear tomorrow, because all it means is you have to meet the limit. We're meeting the limit, plus the error margin, the variability of the machines. Yeah, but our type approval results are transparently available on the website or some individual OEM websites as well. They may show very good results, but let's not forget that one RDE test is a snapshot of performance at that particular point in time. RDE is variable. One RDE test done in the morning might not be the same as the one done in the afternoon. Your normal driving, Monique, is not maybe my normal driving, or Joanna's, or Jens's. Do you have a car? So, you know, the RDE plus the variability factor has to cover the known variability of the measuring procedure. And unfortunately, the measuring procedure is variable. That is why we think that there is still a role for the error margin to play. I would like to get rid of the error margin in some ways. It's a politically motivated thing which can be replaced by a proper SENS standard which demands that PEMS machines are evaluated against a standard to deliver a error variability for that machine. And there is a SENS standard in development at the moment which we hope will be usable by the early part of next year.
Jens.
Yeah, maybe just to react to that, indeed there is work ongoing on the SENS standard, and I think this is definitely not the solution in our opinion, because first of all, it's a closed process for now, where actually it's really difficult for civil society to be part. And also secondly, it does introduce a lot of the questions and raising doubts about the reliability of the equipment that you also mentioned. So we don't see that going from one process behind closed doors back then initially on the conformity factors, we go to the next one where we're not sure how we can use PEMS in the future. The message should be, if there are uncertainties about the PEMS, they also go both directions. So it can happen in certain cases, and JSC also hinted to this. There can be cases where actually the PEMS underestimates the real emissions. How is this taken into account? Not at all, because we look at the worst case and we give the full worst case, so we give all the risk to your lungs, basically, and the people out there. How do we find a balance? And it was discussed in 2015, what's the right balance between the risks? And back then also there was a debate about finding a better, a fairer balance between these interests. And now eventually, 4 years after, we're still with this very one-sided approach. We still have these questions about how reliable the equipment is that are being brought up without really looking at the fact that it goes both ways. So I don't think that's a fair arrangement. It won't be solved by complicating things further, but saying, as I said, if the cars are so clean, well, let's put them on the roads. Let's prove they are so clean. Let's show under all conditions they're really well below the limits, and then people will trust you. I think that's, for me, the way forward.
I agree that it can go both ways. But what happens if you have a certified vehicle which went down, but when somebody like your organization does a test and it goes up? I don't have a magic switch for PEMS machines which says always go down. The PEMS reaction and variability is random. It's not controllable.
Well, definitely, I think that's the whole point of the RD testing. It's not predictable, so that manufacturers cannot prepare for a certain test to just pass it without doing it on the road. So I think that's the whole point. And yes, driving conditions are different, but that's the reality out there, that people use the cars under different conditions in different ways. So I think that's why we introduced that legislation. And then the uncertainty about how exactly each test is conducted should be shared, at the very least, in a fair manner, that then we're sure that the cars will respect and that there is no further discussion, which in the end I think also is about the credibility of this legislation here and of the industry as a whole, to say, okay, we take part of this risk, we deliver you a promise that it will be done on the road. I think this is what we would demand from you, at least.
Thank you. Any more questions at this point? Yes, gentleman there, if you could wait for the microphone, thank you.
Holger Kraber from Daimler. I don't understand why we have this discussion on the error margin. Every technical system, just if you measure kilowatt hours on a washing machine, just if you buy a kilo of meat in the shop, vegetables in the shop, and the shop owner using a scale, every technical system has an error margin. An atomic clock has an error margin. Yeah. If you flashed on the street, if you violate the speed limit, the radar has a technical defined error margin. Why it's not allowed to us to say we are not responsible for technical equipment that we don't develop, that we don't produce, but we have to use to say, have a critical look how exactly this instrument is. I don't understand why we should the uncertainty of a measuring instrument implement into our legislation. Yeah. It's just a question. Yeah? There's nowhere else will help this kind of discussion. I don't understand. Yeah? And the question, do we have an interest to make clean diesels? Yes, of course. I think I can say on behalf of the whole industry that we have a strong interest, diesel taking out of this discussion. And Bas, you provide your fake news. The industry is not running through the parliament and ask for further loopholes. We don't do that. Yeah? We say very clear. No, you just said that we call for further loopholes. We don't do that. Yeah? We are on the way to provide vehicles with conformity factor 1. And that's the legislation from next year on. Yeah? Plus a timeline for vans. Yeah? So in this sense, I don't understand this discussion that we have here a right to pollute. We have 3 years ago implemented, the European Union has implemented a new RDE law, and also regarding to the development times and the production cycles we have, some of the steps takes time, and I think the conformity factors were an instrument, were a tool to make fastest possible development to reduce the emissions. Yeah. That took time. So, and we are now on the way, and the presentation did show that, to provide CF1 vehicles.
Are you going to ask a specific, but do you want to ask a specific question?
No,
I mean, I took your point.
But I think that the question was here, do we have an interest to clean diesel? Yes, we have. Yeah. But I don't understand why we have to take the responsibility for measuring instruments. If JRC is coming to the conclusion, yes, it can be reduced, the error margin, please do that. Yes, it's no problem. But ensure that these measuring instruments are available and buyable. Yeah? We have to buy them, they are expensive, and they have to be available. Yeah? And don't underestimate the last sentence, that we had in the last 5 years, after this diesel scandal, a tremendous system switch to manage, from test bench to PEMS. That's completely new. And we had a lot of deadlocks also in the type approval authorities. They simply had the capacities for all these instruments. Yeah? And I think that has to be considered if you're talking about this kind of complex technical issues.
Thank you. Monique, quick response.
I'm certainly not a technical expert, but I'm really quite amazed by the turn that this discussion is taking, because in fact who is to blame is the measurement industry, measurement units industry. And I thought that the car industry had quite some experience with managing measurement. I think that because in the lab it's also measurement instrument, isn't it? So I mean, what is reliable at the end of the day? I mean, I'm happy that we are not speaking here about aviation industry. I would really be freaking out. Taking a plane. I did not expect that conversation to take place today. Everything is, in fact, externalized. It's not the responsibility of the car industry to deliver us truly clean cars.
Baz.
I absolutely agree with Holger that I'm also astonished on why are we discussing this. Because why we're discussing this, because what we are doing is trying to use the uncertainty of the measurement device to use that to dilute the target that was agreed in 2007. That's what we're doing. And indeed, I don't understand that either. And sorry, Holger, but the car industry is asking for that in the European Parliament. So maybe not Daimler, but I can give you the names who are lobbying in the European Parliament. So don't come with accusations on that you are spreading fake news. The lobby is out there. I was referring immediately to what Paul was saying, that he's now even doubting the JRC report that is lowering the uncertainty. That is even being put in doubt as we speak here. Maybe you missed his statement, but he was saying that. I was reacting to that. But my surprise is why this is the only industry that is using the argument of an uncertainty in a measurement device to use that to dilute a target that we agreed. And indeed, that I don't understand. Glad to agree on that. Let's get rid of it and get just conformity factor 1, and we're out of that discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, I was actually going to come in back to you anyway, because you've just picked up on the sort of next question that I was going to ask, which is moving it forward. You know, the next phase of regulation. How do you see it laying a robust and solid foundation to ensure that the vehicle limits, the limits are more stringent? I mean, what do you want to see going forward? You talk about the conformity factor of 1 or no conformity factor, but what would you like to see in concrete terms?
Well, you also have to wonder at a certain moment that what we are discussing here for the next couple of years, to what extent people in 5, 6, 7 years' time will look back at us and laugh. Because to what extent are we still talking about combustion engines? Where we are, I mean, these all these standards we talk about is for new cars, new models. So how long, I mean, there will be a Euro 7, but you might already ask, how long do we need Euro 7? And can we not go to a zero emission standard? And then we can even laugh more about this discussion on conformity factor, to be very honest. So in that sense, let's indeed go a bit ahead, but then in the meantime, let's not place in the legislation a kind of a very, very dangerous precedent where we are indeed including uncertainties in measurement devices in creating unclarity around a target which is very clear.
So it's less the conformity factor.
And that means we don't need it. And this is a question to the Commission, because the Commission, and now I have to stay polite as well, right? So the Commission promised the Parliament that they would work towards one conformity factor as well. When we were discussing the Dieselgate and all that, the Commission said, we also want to go back to one conformity factor, but we need this for the time being. Why did that get lost? It almost gives you the feeling that the Commission is backtracking on that promise, because in your proposal, there is nothing on where it goes back to one. That's disappointing. We feel that the Commission is a bit backtracking from that. And then on top of that, this proposal was done by the previous Commission. Every day you see here now at the Berlaymont building this huge banner promising that we have a new Commission that is promising more and you know, next level. I don't know the exact slogan, but it's always a good slogan. When do we see the Green New Deal now finally also arriving at the car industry and the car industry legislation? Because that is what we want to see, that the Green Deal is getting there. And we are now bogged down in the discussion of the past because of lobby of car industry. And that's such a pity. And I really wonder when the Commission is going to arrive the Green Deal also here. And then the last point, we are, by having this discussion, we are rewarding the laggards. Because the car industry that is going for innovation and that is already complying with the lower standards, even being below that, they are not rewarded. We are rewarding the laggards with this kind of legislation and with even going for the highest uncertainty margin. Why are we doing that? Isn't the Green Deal about stimulating innovation, stimulating clean airs and clean innovation? That's what we should be doing. We should not be rewarding the laggards, and that is, unfortunately, what we are doing.
Commission sending mixed messages.
That's a very polite summary.
I'm always polite.
Well, I don't think we are sending mixed messages, and you wouldn't expect me to say anything else, obviously, but let me explain. But I will nevertheless start by saying that the picture regarding discussion on cleaning the cars, conformity factor for that matter, is a little bit more nuanced than what we see or hear today in this room. I think we don't have very clear-cut views in the Parliament where we should go. We don't have very clear-cut views in the Council. This is all very much, it differs depending on with whom you talk and what arguments are advanced. So it's not that there is an industry wanting one way, Parliament being forcefully pushing in the opposite way, and the Council has also clear view. No, the views are very mixed, and I think it's important to keep it in mind. This is not black and white situation. Secondly, I'm a little bit puzzled or concerned that we are putting a sign of equality between Green Deal and conformity factors. Because Green Deal is not about conformity factors. And by no means I'm trying to downplay this discussion. On the contrary, we are also very concerned that this is going on. We are very concerned that there is lack of understanding of arguments on both sides. This is not where we should be almost 5 years into the Dieselgate. This is not what we want to discuss with you today. We want to discuss with you where we go ahead with battery electric vehicles. We want to discuss with you where we go with automation. We want to discuss with you how we position ourselves vis-à-vis China and the US, and not talk about conformity factors. But not because Commission is tired or fed up or backtracking, not at all. We are here to do our duty and we'll do this. But we are not backtracking. I'm just saying that we should really open a little bit the picture and do not think that the Green Deal is about conformity factor. Because if you really look backwards, I will talk about the future in a second. Look what has been done beyond RDE legislation from October 2015. We have introduced rules that haven't had their place in the legislation for years, whether it's light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, whether it's investigation regarding defeat devices, whether it's guidance that made part of the legislation, whether it's calling manufacturers to prove what they do, to be surveilled, to have mechanisms for type approval that were unheard of, or actually still are unheard of, because the rules will enter into force on 1st of September this year. Why no one is talking about this when pointing out to the Commission? And please keep this in mind, that greening and Green Deal didn't start with the Commission of Mrs. von der Leyen. She made it a flagship, rightly so, but we had started preparing for it much earlier. And was Dieselgate a trigger? Possibly it was, yes. But we have used it as an opportunity to move and to venture into areas that we didn't think of before, ever. So don't talk about conformity factor as deal breaker and as the most relevant element of the regulatory frame, because it is not. And secondly, do not think that this is the legislation that does change the reality. It may stimulate, it may provoke, but this is not because of the legislation that the industry, this one or any other industry, wants to compete or wants to sell their products. Because consumers are expecting certain type of products of certain quality, of certain price, and because there is a global competition, and if not this industry being global, there is no other one. So the pressure is coming from the legislation as well, that the pressure is coming from simply competitive behavior of people out there beyond the European Union. Keep it in mind, this is not conformity factor that makes whoever, and we are talking about automotive industry, to move ahead. So this is about the past, about the future. We put in place all administrative system of checking the approvals before they are issued, of checking cars in course of their life, having market surveillance. It is for the member states to have it implemented. And you know what? I looked at recommendations from EMIS that you issued on, what was it, April 2017. There are 95 points in the recommendations, and I think approximately 70 are addressed to the Commission. If we have done all 70 items, probably not, probably about 50 or 60. But there is a handful addressed to the member states. And hardly anyone checks on the member states what they do with the type approval, how they are preparing their laboratories, their technical services, how much money they put on it, how they train their staff to do the market surveillance of type approval. Have you checked it? Please do so. Because it's not about the Commission and us setting the rules. It is about member states, how they are implementing those rules. And this is where the next problem will be. So this is something very important to be checked. And you know what? There's only one recommendation I found from the Parliament to the industry. So it's excellent to say that the Commission didn't do their job or that we are now playing with conformity factors. But we have to be clear who was at the heart of the problem. It was not that the law was such. Law may be good or bad, but it is not there to be violated by anyone. So we might not have been happy with laboratory tests, we are much more happy with real driving emission tests, but nevertheless, it was for no one to violate the rules on laboratory testing. And there was something happened, and we know who is responsible for that, and who was supposed to take the action. So just to finish, the forward-looking perspective, I think you mentioned that we are talking about Euro 7, and God knows how long we'll have internal combustion engine. This is a very right point. What we want to do, we are definitely pushing ahead with battery electric, with hydrogen. That's why we have launched a lot of forward-looking activity, not least on batteries, and we are now working on hydrogen. But because we believe that in the next 10 years, maybe 15 years, no one knows and no one will tell you, combustion engine must be better. And this is the reason why we are embarking on Euro 7. So if someone is here to tell us, you are not doing right thing as far as the Green Deal is concerned, I think he or she will be simply wrong, and I'm happy to take this challenge and explain once again. Thank you.
Paul. You can pick up on that, obviously. But I was actually also going to ask you how you see particularly the Euro 7 regulation as an opportunity to sort of shape the future standards and testing system in a way that isn't just about providing legal certainty, but also actually does help cars make that transition to being, you know, completely, whether it's a 1.0 conformity factor or cleaner altogether, and we get, you know, completely clean diesel. How do you see the regulation help shaping that?
Well, the current regulation on the table at the moment on RDE is needed to give industry legal certainty, because otherwise the implications of the court judgment, depending on the appeal, is quite serious.
I'm talking about Euro 7.
Euro 7 studies are underway. We are participating in those studies with the Commission stakeholder meetings. And we're broadly supportive of the aim to go to a next stage of emission standards. There is technical justifications for doing so. Other global markets have moved on, one might expect. But we don't see a need necessarily that there has to be like a mechanical reduction of the numbers in the lab, because in the end, what matters to vehicles is what is the performance on the road. It's not the lab performance. We think the lab is still needed there for measuring CO2, because that provides the standardized values for the CO2 framework that we have, which is lab-based measurements on the COC to monitor against fleet requirements. But we do agree that there is that the next round will be a major focus on pollutants. Today's regulated, maybe some new non-regulated pollutants as well, on RDE conditions, on-road driving conditions. Now, there may be some areas of the current RDE framework that we have, which is quite extensive anyway, some additional areas that may need to be looked into to improve the performance of vehicles across the whole playing field of RDE. And then the last point, of course, whatever comes next, we would agree that it's going to be a technically neutral set of emission limits without distinction between different fuels.
Jens.
Yeah, I think on the last detail, we could definitely agree there has to be fuel neutral, and for example, petrol cars shouldn't have stricter limits to diesel. Diesel should have the same strict limits as petrol. But maybe looking at the bigger picture, I think you're right to say, let's not only look at the small marginal improvements that need to be made. I think in the end, it all comes down to a question you should also ask yourself. What level of pollution are you comfortable with? What level of pollution do you think is safe for also the elderly and the children out there in the street, and not just healthy individuals, like hopefully most of us right here? So clearly, when you look at the science, and there was a conference a few weeks ago here in Brussels organized by the World Health Organization and the Health Effects Institute, which is co-funded by the car industry, so it's watertight evidence. I think you would agree with that, Paul, right? The Health Effects Institute in the US. The American Institute, they really bring absolutely solid evidence, and they say there is no safe level of pollution so far. So even if you go well below the limits that we have today for the concentration in the air, you still see the negative effects on people's health. So I think this should really set now the course, and we really welcome the initiative of the Commission to say we aim for zero pollution and we aim for zero emissions eventually. And that's something we criticize the Commission a lot, because we think that you could always do more and better. But on this, really, I think that is a bold move forward. But for this to happen, of course, we have to start now and here. And I think that's why I would also agree that the RDE file now is a litmus test to see how serious are we about this. If we can't correct these smaller things compared to the overall picture, how are we going to address the issue of going towards zero emissions? If we can't even now settle this thing, conformity factors coming back after years of discussions. So I think to get the credibility on the big questions, we also need to set this straight, phase out the conformity factor as it was announced by the Commission a few years ago and promised. And also, secondly, in the meantime, use the best available technology and evidence to really make sure that the incentives are right. So I really think that there's a big opportunity for us to address this year. And then in a few years' time, hopefully, we will say, okay, back then we did the right thing. But we can't wait until the end of the Commission mandate, I think, to start delivering on this. We've seen this many times, I think, that then it's too late. And then the next Commission, next Parliament will have to do it. That's not enough. So definitely do follow up on this. We would encourage you, which shouldn't prevent you from doing the right thing here and now, actually.
Thank you. Yes, Monique.
Yes, I would like to say, I mean, in the short term, I can understand as a lawyer that you have this problem about keeping the same content while adapting to the procedure because of the Court of Justice decision, but still a signal would be the right thing to do. We would, in a perfect world, we would really like to get rid of the conformity factor. If that's not possible, there can be like either phasing out or get back to the GRC levels, 132 rather than 50 or 43. But I also agree with you that it's the big picture that counts, and certainly for consumers, because the European Green Deal, there's a lot of talk about European Green Deal, but if you really want to make that a reality for the climate, you need consumers to be in. And that means that consumers have to undergo systemic life change, the way they eat, the way they move in their car, or not in the car, they move from point A to point B, the way they save their money or they invest their money, the way they live in their homes, the way they buy or use products. So there is a huge challenge for consumers, and the low-hanging fruit has been picked up. There is much more things that have to change in the way we as consumers behave, and people need help for that. They need support, and having a very clear agenda for transport is very important. We don't know, we as consumers don't know whether combustion engines will still be alive, or be allowed in cities. Diesel cars is now a little bit in between, but in 10 years, what's happening? The next scandal will arrive, and what happens. So having a clear agenda where people can know, conventional cars are going to be much cleaner, or there is much more offer of electric cars, or let's say alternative fueled cars. And the most important one, the biggest picture is there are alternatives to cars for transport, which is of course an even more systemic change that needs to be made. And this is something, it's of course very complex, and many DGs also, I guess, that are involved there. But it is needed to be very blunt. And if we are discussing already years and years about conformity factor, what will it take to have another way of transport on the planet? So, I mean, good luck, can I say so?
Baz, I'm just going to come to you back to sort of to link some of this stuff together. With the Euro 6 legislation that's going to be voted on in a few weeks' time, how do you see that based on what Jens was saying about setting it up for Euro 7? So what would you like to see? You know, we've talked about, yes, I know conformity factors, but actually what would be the building blocks from Euro 6 that you would like to see informing Euro 7 going forward?
That's a difficult question. I think what I would like to see is that the Parliament is already signaling that they want Euro 7, that indeed we don't do any differentiation anymore between diesel and gasoline, because we're doing that now. Diesel is allowed to pollute more than gasoline, as if for citizens it matters where the NOx comes from. So in that sense, that we take out that we of course look at more of the particles, that it's not only about NOx, we are really extending also when we are looking at the pollution. And I do think it is very important to really also start a discussion, and this is going to be a difficult one. What are we going to do with those countries that want to phase out combustion engines? Because there are more and more countries doing that. And saying that they want to do that. At this moment, that is pretty difficult within the internal market of the EU. I think it's going to be a very bad message from the EU to citizens if, for example, a country like Denmark will have to tell back to their citizens, sorry, we can't do the phase-out because of Brussels. You know, in times of where EU is not always the most popular institution in the world, I don't think those are the right messages that you want to see. So I'm absolutely happy that the Commission is saying the Green Deal, we're working on that and it's coming, but we need to see some trust that there is really a shift in the attitude. And that is partly on Euro 7 and really making clear on that we are now going to make sure that we keep the car industry to live up to that. But I also think we need to address that issue of how do we go about with countries that want to move ahead? Mm-hmm. And how do we go with that kind of challenge between the internal market and that? On environmental, it's always easy. Countries are allowed to go further, but this is where internal market is really getting into play. And I think it is going to be very important from the Commission not just to have the answer, it's internal market, sorry Denmark, but you will have to wait until all the countries of the EU will agree on such a date. I think it's going to be important to allow countries to move ahead, because that's really going to be the Green Deal, innovation by leading, and sometimes it's also countries that want to lead.
Yeah.
That will be very brief. I thought it would have been more ambitious, so consider it done, except for the last point, because I think we will surprise you with what you would like to introduce in Euro 7. I think we intend to go much beyond. This is indeed also what you set out, but we want to be indeed much more forward-looking with legislation. On the last point, we understand your concern, and we have had this discussion with member states. I don't want to sound like a lawyer that I am, but we certainly cannot go against the treaty. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about the ways how to promote shift by means which are not always regulatory, but which create incentives in the right sense in order to shift from what we have today to the new generation. So this is something that we are going to discuss as well. And of course, we count on your engagement in the discussion on Euro 7.
Yeah, Jens.
That I can promise you.
Jens, yes.
Yeah, quick comment just on this. I think it's really important to now look at the internal market dimension, and if we want to go ahead to reach the 2050 climate targets, how are we going to do this? Not by keeping the internal combustion on the markets, on the roads forever. And we really think that the revision of the CO2 standards that will hopefully come in 2021 as announced, this is the big opportunity to get this right, to say, okay, we align with what we're doing for cars with what we're doing for the climate altogether, and then this will be a pretty straightforward, and also it will be in line with the treaty, of course, because the legislators, so we also count on Parliament, obviously, to make sure that we can set this pathway towards zero emissions by 2050.
Paul, did you?
Yeah, I guess in many ways the CO2 review for cars, which is now next year, and trucks, which we think is still 2022, will set the scene. Because manufacturers now think, what investment decisions do I have to make for 10, 12 years in the future? And depending on the outcome of those reviews and the level of severity of future CO2 standards, then there may be commercial decisions made which will diminish the future of the combustion engine. We have to see. We think the combustion engine can get cleaner, and it will get cleaner, but we also think there is a role for the oil industry to deliver cleaner fuels, lower carbon fuels. Other options, zero carbon powertrain as well, as part of the overall mix. So while Euro 7 may be coming, you also have to consider whether other regulatory approaches, particularly the CO2 framework, will start to make a push in a direction anyway.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions from the audience. So if you'd like to, here's your last chance. Oh. Okay, brilliant. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Yes, hello. Pascal Zenz from Agence Europe. It's just a very specific question for the European Commission. Sorry, it won't be very highly political, maybe. Next week, you are going to present the action plan on the single market. Are you planning to improve maybe the monitoring of national authorities regarding car homologation? Because of what I have seen nothing regarding that specific point. And I'm not sure, you say that we need to respect the European treaties if a member state will not respect, or maybe if cities will not respect some principles of the internal market. Does it mean that the Commission could consider, if it happens, to open infringement, even if it's maybe science fiction for now? But that's one of my questions. Thank you.
I prefer not to talk about science fiction, and I'll maybe try to make sure that I understood right your second question. But on the first question, it's a very important one. And, well, I wouldn't like to comment on the content of documents that are to be adopted in the future, but what I can tell you, which is even more important than this communication, is the law as has been already adopted, because your point is very correct. This is something that has to change, and surveillance and control of the authorities, whether these are homologation authorities or type approval authorities or market surveillance, has to be put in place. And this is exactly what the new type approval framework that is entering into force in 5 months foresees. So you will see that there is a major difference compared to the status quo, including what we call peer reviews of technical services, the rules that consider that there has to be periodical check of efficiency of the work of the authorities made by member states, but also by the Commission, so GRC. So there is a system of checks and balances in this regulation that aims at preventing leniency, let me put it this way. But it all depends to what I had said before, which is how member states are going to implement the rules, how much money and resources they are going to put in order to have the system tight, watertight. So this is already in place, and don't be afraid that you don't find it if you don't find it in the communication, because this is hard law and not just communication. Okay? And on the infringement, well, I'm really sorry, I might have missed something from what you said. Of course, if there is an infringement of whether it's a secondary law or the treaty, we will consider always opening an investigation. Now it's to be judged on the basis of a case at stake, so no general answer unless there's a specific problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was a question here. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. It's Josh Pisano from Politico. Just a clarification on the ASEA point. So the JRC came out with a report indicating, after its review of all of the available PEMS technologies, that 0.32 should be the conformity factor. But you say that you don't, from the industry side, you don't agree with that. So despite all the scientific evidence, you say that 0.32 is still not the appropriate amount.
I wouldn't say it's all the scientific evidence. There is other data available which shows other things. I mean, the JRC report, quickly to summarise, is a recalculation of the error margin. It hasn't demonstrated that there's been an actual improvement in the machines themselves. They've recalculated some of the factors which affect the variability of the overall package. There are some elements of criticism in there, and the JRC has calculated its 0.32 based on a limit value of 80 for diesel. If you do a calculation based on a 60 limit value for petrol, you come out at 0.38. So there are areas which we would like to have a further look at, but on initial reading, since it only came out last week, there are some areas where it could be subject to criticism.
Thank you. Final round of questions, anyone? You would like to ask one, Daphne? Okay.
Thank you. I'm Daphne Blokhuis from the Netherlands Permanent Representation. And I was wondering if there aren't any other questions. I have a final question, maybe also to the panel. We understood from the Commission the Green Deal and the conformity factors are not the same. We know that. We are now dealing with the regulation that's on the table at now. And looking forward, there is, of course, the different proposals in the Green Deal and the different ambitions we want to work towards. Maybe as a final question to the panel, can you give us back, what do you feel the regulation we're negotiating on now should actually contain in order to prepare for that in the future? Thank you.
Paul.
Because of the pending appeal of the court case, it's necessary that this legislation reinserts into the legislation in the correct legal way the same parameters without any substantive change, and that's our clear position on this.
Okay. Monique.
Because of the important link that has to be made with the European Green Deal and that the urgency that is also signaled there, it is important to get rid of the conformity factor.
Okay.
And if that's not possible, have a phasing out, but that is really clearly set, to the minimum that can be acceptable is the GRC, which is for us the most objective research, let's say, research-based decision-making in this context.
Okay. Baz?
Well, on top of that, I think what is very important is if you look at the targets of the Green Deal, it's going to be climate neutrality by 2050 and a zero pollution economy. Well, it is very important that what we're doing now are preparing us for a zero pollution economy, and that should really be set here, and the provision should be set here that it's certainly not working against it. And that indeed, that is then translating into, then let's at the minimum get rid of this conformity factor and make it very clearly when it should be won, but also make very clear what Euro 7 as a stepping stone to a zero polluting car industry is, because the car industry is one of the easier sectors to get to zero pollution. We have some other sectors we need to tackle as well, so the car industry is one of the easier ones.
Well, just to follow up sort of slightly more than that, when you say this Euro 7 as a stepping stone, can you be a bit more specific?
Well, that's what I said. I mean, you can already wonder to what extent, how long will we need Euro 7, because I do think that the phase out of the combustion engine is going much faster than what we already discussed a couple of years ago when we were talking CO2 standards. I think we are beating those CO2 standards much faster than what we thought of before, and I think that's going to be the same with Euro 7. So Euro 7 very clearly needs to be a stepping stone towards zero pollution. So that's kind of the last moment in time when we are accepting pollution by passenger cars. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by stepping stone, because in the end, the future will be a non-polluting car. And Euro 7, even if it's a stricter standard, we are still accepting pollution. And that's going back to also what Jens said. In the end, there are no threshold values for pollution. NOx is always having an impact on us. And especially for people living in the cities, why are we allowing that if we can have the alternatives? And that's why I said for cars we can have the alternatives. So let's make sure that Euro 7 is the last stepping stone towards zero pollution.
Jens.
Yeah, I think I can echo what most of you said. Clearly, I mean, when you look back, when this original regulation was adopted, it was weeks after Dieselgate got revealed. It was a huge scandal, I think, for many people to say. We're in the middle of one of the biggest scandals in the history of Europe when it comes to the industry, at least, and now we're deciding to water down the rules, the laws. And then people were crazy because even the 2.1 wasn't based on any margin error, it was even more than this. And then now today, there's a golden opportunity to say, okay, we've learned from this. A few years later, better cars, better PEMS equipment, as we've seen with the evidence. So there's no reason now not to really set an end date to the conformity factor, say whatever certainty there is, it can't just be put on one shoulder. It should be put at least in a fair deal on both sides. And this should happen soon. So I think this is the time to really set an end date, a sunset clause to the conformity factor.
Thank you. And final point from Commission.
Well, so 4 points. One is that the proposal as has been tabled, we consider it is adequate for the reasons I already exposed before. Secondly, we welcome any useful suggestions coming from the Parliament and from the Council. You forgot to say that we indeed declared to move conformity factor to 1, but you forgot to add by when. When was it? So the declaration that you referred to, that we would move with conformity factor to 1. I don't know the date. Ha. We are still on time. So it was 2023. And why did you not propose it? Wait until 2023. And then this regulation is not the answer to the problems we are trying to sort out. So we are looking forward to Euro 7 because this is where you will find replies to all the questions that you have raised today.
Okay.
So just to understand, so you would say that the 2023 commitment to phase it out, go down to 1, the conformity factor basically, removing it by 2023 is still what the intention is of the current process?
I only said that there is a declaration of the Commission which indicates a number and a date, and that's it. Thank you.
Okay. And on that note, I think we're going to leave it there. So I'd like to thank all our speakers for such an enlightened and at times passionate discussion. I don't use that word lightly. And also to the audience for your questions. It's been a very illuminating event all round. There are some drinks over here. You'll be able... Oh, and of course, before that, though, we do have our closing remarks. My brain has been completely technically addled. I would like to welcome Dorthe Nielsen, who's Policy Director from Eurocities, to come and make the closing remarks. Thank you, Dorthe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura. I don't know if you're so relieved to, that we have concluded this debate that you thanks for this very, I think, stimulating debate. Wouldn't say it was very, very. I'm hesitating to using the word interesting because we are not here to be entertained, but it's rare to see such a diversity of opinions out up front in these debates that we're used to here in Brussels. So I've been offered the opportunity to just say a few concluding remarks, not a summary at all of the debate, thankfully. But I think it's an opportunity just to bring out a few points that are very important for cities, which we represent as Eurocities, the network of big European cities, and cities which have been mentioned a lot here in the debate. And so we've heard in the discussions that the implications of poor air quality, that they have a serious impact on the public health, the quality of life, and the environment. And we know that transport emissions are a key contributor to the premature death in cities at the level of 70,000 deaths each year, as an estimate by the European Environment Agency. So in our network, Eurocities, we work with city authorities every day. We see that they're committed to trying to deliver clean air for people living in cities. And to do that, they have tools, they employ measures to do so, low emission zones, promoting active mobility, walking, cycling, investment in public transport, stimulating behavioral change and exchange on good practices. But of course, local measures will never be enough. We need also the support from European level and from member states to really protect public health and ensure that local air pollution limits are kept well within the EU legal limits. So, with the Green Deal, we see that the Commission is committed to moving towards a zero pollution future, which is encouraging. And we also look forward to the stronger provisions on air quality legislation and stringent air pollution emission standards for vehicles. And the ruling of the Court of Justice brought forward by the 3 cities to dispute the emission limits brought by the European Commission, it is a true opportunity to achieve this. Real driving emission testing was intended to ensure compliance with vehicle emission standard, not to weaken them. And the conformity factors, as noted by the court, de facto modify the limits, the emission limits of for NOx. So, as soon as possible, we must ensure that the emission limits are met under real driving emission conditions. And so we look forward to the final phase of the negotiations between the Parliament and the Council. And we trust that the co-legislators will do the right thing. Protecting the health of the people and keeping pollutants within limit values, it will depend on our ability to implement credible, real driving emission standards. If ever there was an opportunity for the EU to demonstrate that it can have a real and positive impact on the lives that we live in the cities, this is a case in point. If someone then asks us 10 years from now on, what has the EU ever done for us? We can say peace, a long time ago, roaming standards, a roaming cost, and then there's also clean air and getting rid of the conformity factors. For the EU to, this would be sort of, for the EU to demonstrate the real and positive impact. I think just left for me to say is to thank then the Perm Rep of the Netherlands for hosting us in this fabulous building here. Also to the panelists and to everybody else for the engagement in this debate and the contribution to the debate both today and in general for these issues that is so important for cities. And I think we also owe great thanks to our great moderator, Laura, if it's up to me to say so. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorte. And yes, drinks. And I think all the presentations will be available, I think be mailed out after the event. So if you want to catch up with any of that then and read to your heart's content, then do feel free. In the meantime, drinks are over here. Thank you all very much. Thank you.